Well, welcome. We're here with Eric McKee and Mervyn looking down over Moneymore. We're looking back at the years of the World War II, and we're here to discuss some of your memories of that time. As we look down over Moneymore, has Moneymore changed much since the outbreak of World War II?
Well, it has changed quite a bit. It's much bigger now than it was then. Moneymore traditionally was a village of about 500 people, and the actual village was contained in the old village as it is now, but the new houses all around the estates have made probably 2 or 3 thousand people now. But in the days of the Second World War, there were just 500 people lived in Moneymore, so it was much smaller than it was now.
Moneymore was actually an army base before the Americans came here. Moneymore was taken over. The first army came to train here was the Royal Berkshires from England, and they came to Moneymore and commandeered the manor house, the courthouse, the Old Orange Hall, which used to be around
the assembly rooms, I think you had.
the commandeered the assembly rooms
and the Masonic Hall,
the Masonic Hall, and the barnyard, and the market yard too. All that was all commandeered by the army, and the Circular Road was blocked off as a vehicle car park for the Royal Berkshire Regiment. They were an artillery regiment, and they were there for some years before the Americans appeared on the scene.
And what are your memories of the outbreak of war, the year war was declared in 1939?
My memories of the outbreak of war, I have just one memory that comes to mind, and that was that we, as you know, were in the quarry business, and we had lorries at that time, and not very good lorries, but we did have lorries. And I remember the War Department coming to the police station in Moneymore and commandeering the best of our fleet of lorries and taking them away, left us with no lorries for quarry. That was my first idea of war. I was only about 16 or 17 then, that time.
And where did you hear the announcement? Where were you?
When I heard the day war was announced was a Sunday, the 3rd of September from memory, and I was at Port Stewart with my family for the weekend, and I remember sitting in the promenade in my car, which was the first car I ever had, and here coming through, Chamberlain came on to say that as and from 11 o'clock today we are at war with Germany. And his voice was gruff and sober. It was, to us, to me as a young man, it didn't mean all that much, but it started to rain that day, just after that announcement, and I rain, thunder and lightning all day. You'd have thought that there was somebody from somewhere or other reprimanding us for what had happened.
Well, Paul, I just remember vaguely, but I remember one incident quite well. I was just 5 years and 9 months the day war broke out, but I was going to church. It was a Sunday with my father, and we were going down the hill towards First Moneymore, and we were joined by Bob Rankin. Now, Bob Rankin was was a grocer in Moneymore. He was an old soldier of First World War, as my father was. And I always remember this comment he made as we met. He said, "Charlie," that was my father, "we didn't do the job well enough the first time, and we'll have to do it again." So that stuck with me all these years, and I don't remember anything else he said, but I remember that. Or I don't remember anything that happened in church, but I remember that quite well. And as Mervyn says, there was a very bad thunderstorm in the afternoon in Moneymore, and I was afraid of the lightning. A friend of my father's came into the house to discuss the war, and he took me outside to the porch to let me see the lightning and to tell me it wouldn't do me any harm, and I stood there the whole time, and I think that did help me because I never really was afraid of thunderstorms after that. So, but it lasted, as Mervyn says, quite a while, and the rain was torrential, and that's all I remember really on that day.
It's difficult to put memories to what happened the first few months of the war, because we didn't really realise in a place like Moneymore really that we were at war. It was something that was just happening every day. And I remember all the building contractors or people who do anything but building around here were more or less commandeered and used by the army to make the billets, as they call them. The assembly rooms was the canteen for the Royal Berkshire Regiment. All the and the sleeping quarters were all the places like the courthouse, the Banner House, the Orange Hall, the Masonic Hall, the Barn Hall, Barnyard, and the Market Yard were all the sleeping quarters, and the eating was all done in the assembly rooms.
So, well, it was a big shock in a sense to, especially the young people, all these soldiers coming into the town. But there wasn't much action in the first years of the war. It was the phony war sort of thing, and nothing much was happening abroad, and there wasn't a lot of talk about the war, but all these soldiers were here, and it was of great interest to the children, especially to see so many soldiers marching about and drilling. They used to drill on the main street, and of course there was no traffic during the war, for all the vehicles were off the road unless for essential vehicles. And there was only army vehicles, so they were able to drill there, and we would go down and watch them. And as children, we learned how to do these different things, slope arms and shoulder arms and port arms, and we would play games doing this. The other thing I remember was in the manor house was the officers' mess, and the officers all lived there, or most of them anyway. And there was a Major Rotten. He was in charge, and he was a very stout man, big man, stout, but he was very severe. Most of the officers were very friendly with the children, and we would salute them when we met them, because we knew soldiers had to salute the officers, and we would salute the officers, and they would salute back. But this Major Rotten, when we saluted him, he just scowled at us. So we didn't salute him then. He never got the honour of a salute after that, and we just saluted the other officers, and they saluted back. And I think we had a good rapport with the soldiers. They were quite friendly, and we really enjoyed them being there. It was of interest to us what they were doing, and their lorries and all, as Mervyn said, they were on the circular road. And
Circular road was closed off on both ends. It was a vehicle park, and there was maybe 150 lorries back along the circular road, and you had to have a permit to pass through
that part of the town.
Some of the officers had brought their wives over to live in some of the houses of the circular road that were vacant.
That's right.
And some of the officers had their wives and families there.
And the Berkshire Regiment was the Berkshire Yeomanry, and most of the officers were aristocrats. They had estates, and there was the Ormsby Goers and the Birchills. And still, you would still hear of the Ormsby Goers yet. Some of them were British ambassadors and were involved in politics. And they carried on their traditions when they came over here. And one of the things I remember as well was on the 1st of May, and on their estates in England, they always had a rook shoot. And these rooks, or we would call them crows, but they're really rooks. They shot the young crows to thin them down, you see. There would have been too many of them. And they used .22 rifles for doing that. But because they hadn't their own rifles with them, they had just the 303 Lee Enfields. They had Morris tubes for inserting into the barrel of these so as they could shoot .22 ammunition for target practice. But their ammunition was very scarce. Now, my father was the manager of the co-op in Moneymore, and it was a sort of a general emporium, sold everything, and they sold ammunition and guns as well. So it was Captain Birchall came to my father to ask him, could he give him some .22 ammunition for this rook shoot? And they were shooting rooks at the bottom of the Manor House Gardens and up at the rectory. So my father gave him 200 or 300 rounds of .22 ammunition. They were very grateful for that. And then the next evening they were having a party, having rook pie. And my father and mother were invited to the Manor House to this party. Well, my mother refused to go. She couldn't eat old crows. So my father had to make an excuse then and say my mother wasn't feeling too well and she wasn't able to go. But the next morning they brought him over a bit of this root pie and he ate it. And I don't remember whether I ate any of it or not, but he ate it and thought it was quite good. So that was one of the things I remember.
You were asking us there about had Moneymore changed much. Moneymore, during the first years of the war, didn't really change. You would hardly have known there was a war on. Life went on as usual, and the local people here spent their time entertaining the troops, and had dances once a week at the assembly. That kind of thing went on. But life went on more or less as usual, and anything that happened in the army, everything was secret, and so many things happening that we would not have known anything about being people residents at the time.
Well, you talk about the Berkshires. At what point did the Americans arrive?
Well, the Americans, I think it was about 1942.
I remember the first Americans. I was standing outside Johnny Weir's bicycle shop, which is next door to where you live. And I remember seeing these guys coming walking around the corner, and the Americans marched 3 deep, not 4 deep like the British Army. 3 deep. They come up past the police station and up past Johnny Weir's, marching 3 abreast with shawls and picks over their shoulders. Little did I know they were heading up to my father's quarry. Without any permission of any kind. They didn't need permission to do anything. They just walked in and started quarrying stones. And they had arrived from Derry by boat, down the Derry Central Railway line, to build this depot in Moneymore to supply the Ministry of Defence. And they made, on the railway line from Cookstown to, or Moneymore, or Mockerfield to Cookstown, the depot at Larry Cormac. They made 2 branch railway lines, one on each side of the road, and they made a spur off the railway line, and all the supplies came in by boat to Derry, came down by train down the Derry Central line to Cookstown Junction, and came up and were offloaded in the depot here at Moneymore, which was a huge place at that time. So it was.
That depot at Larry Cormac that Mervyn's speaking about was one of the main centres for medical supplies.
It carried everything from false teeth to silk stockings.
That's right. They had
and it ran the biggest black market in the country.
Well, it was a terrific stock of stuff they had. They were planning for the invasion, you see.
Very highly organised. Very highly organised.
And they had terrific supplies of everything. And the colonel in charge, now I don't remember his name, but Mavis Thompson would know his name. I must ask Mavis again. He was quite friendly with the local doctor, Dr. Cowsley. And he used to come up to Cowsley's house and have supper and so on. And I was friendly with Dr. Cowsley's children. We used to be playing there, and I remember speaking to this man. But a very interesting fact, Paul, Dr. Cowsley, I think, was possibly the very first GP maybe in Great Britain to use penicillin. Now, the Americans had big supplies of penicillin, but it wasn't available. It wasn't readily available. It was for the invasion, but you knew there'd be a lot of casualties. So Dr. Cowsley had a patient, I think he was in his mid-40s, who had pneumonia, and he had 5 or 6 children, and Dr. Cowsley thought he was going to die. And this colonel in charge was also a doctor. He was a medical man, and he got this man to come out and see this patient, and they both agreed that the man would probably die. And Dr. Cowsley had heard, he'd never seen penicillin or didn't know anything about it, but he had heard about it, and this man had some experience of using it. So he kindly gave him some penicillin. And Dr. Cowsley subsequently told me that the penicillin was in what were known as hypodermic tablets. They were little tablets in a sealed vial, and the way you made them up was you put one of them into a syringe, tapped it out into the syringe, drew in the water, and it dissolved, and then you injected it in. It wasn't in a vial as it is now. The interesting point from my point of view was the dose that they gave the man was 10,000 units. Now, today, you need to give maybe 10 million units of penicillin because of the resistance, but they gave this man 10,000 units, and they went back in 8 hours and gave him another 10,000 units, and possibly a third one, I'm not sure, but they certainly gave him 2, and that pulled him through, and the man survived, and he wouldn't have survived without that. So that's an interesting fact. At least it did some good to the residents of Moneymore. But they had, Dr. Cowsley was out there and saw that, and he told me the equipment they had, the portable theatres and everything of the very best, that some of the hospitals here weren't as well equipped as they would have for field hospitals.
In Larrycormac?
Larrycormac.
The main object of this depot at Larrycormac was to supply the American Army, and built the 2 aerodromes, one at Tombridge and one at Arboe. Those 2 aerodromes were both built, and their main object was to train and rest pilots that had been in Germany, and they came back there for rest. But all the supplies went from, I'll tell you one story that I do remember well. The main supplies went from here to Arboe or Toom by lorry and were taken by aircraft to Germany or France or wherever needed. But after the invasion, the American storemen who were in charge of this camp down here had made friends with a donkey, and then this donkey was their symbol on Moneymore. Walked up the street with them, went everywhere with them. But eventually, at very short notice, the Americans were switched to Germany, and of course the donkey was left behind, and the donkey pined for the Americans and was in a very bad health and was going to die. And eventually, I remember being told, I don't know how much truth there is, that the Americans sent a liberator all the way from Germany to Arboe to take the donkey and took the donkey out to Germany. That was supposed to be a true story that happened at that time.
Well, I could tell you another story about when you mention a donkey, Mervyn. When the Americans came here, you see, the British troops walked or they went on bicycles or maybe in a lorry, but the Americans had countless jeeps and they flew everywhere. They rode bicycles too, of course, but they went everywhere in jeeps, open jeeps, you see. And of course, they were used to driving on the wrong side of the road. For us, they were driving on the right-hand side of the road, but there was no traffic and it didn't really matter much. But there was an apocryphal story told about a resident here up at Lisson, a man at Lisson. In those days, there were little creameries all over the country, and the farmers took their milk to the creamery. And Mick, from up here near Lisson, was taking the donkey and cart with a creamery can of milk to Lisson Creamery. And he was going along the little road, and an American truck came around the road, a jeep came around the road with a lieutenant, as they call him, and a couple of GIs in it, on the wrong side of the road. And the they hit the front of the donkey. Just they swerved off, but they just touched the donkey. And the jack went over the hedge, fell in, and the creamery can spilled out, and Mick was thrown out, and he was lying down on the ground, and the donkey was in the hedge struggling, you see. So the GA had been a rancher, and he knew all about horses. So the lieutenant jumped out, you see, and he went over to the donkey, and he caught it by the leg, and he says, "Gee, boy, broken," he says. So he just pulls out his pistol and shoots the donkey in the head. And he comes over to Mick, and he's still holding the pistol, smoking pistol in his hand, and he says to Mick, looking down at him, "Mick," he said, "Well, guy, how are you?" And Mick says, "I declare to God, sir, I never felt better in all my life."
Very good. Very good.
There's many stories, and you could memorise them all, you know.
But they certainly they made more of a stir, as they say in Moneymore, the GAs, and of course they were great dancers, and at the dances, and the girls were all thought these GAs were great fellas, were the great jitterbuggers and jivers, and they were very generous too, and they had good supplies, of course, Mervyn.
Oh yes,
ice cream,
you were
and
friendly with
sweets,
any of the Americans that was anything at all you wanted, all you had to do was just bench, you got it.
And they had everything really that was required. We never got any ice cream, but they used to have parties for the children in the summer and at Christmas, and they would feed us
One
with
thing
ice
that
cream.
I don't want to forget about, Eric, is one thing that kept us all interested in Moneymore was the formation of the Home Guard. In other words, just Dad's Army.
Yeah.
There was a section formed at Moneymore, and Jack Sanford and Tom White and were the officers in charge of that, and Roy Simpson they were all the officers. The sergeant major was Walter Moore, which you wouldn't possibly remember. Walter was the sergeant major, and a rare outfit, I can tell you, as Dad's Army, exactly as you would see it on TV now.
Well, if Walter Bow was involved,
I rose to the dizzy heights of being a corporal.
At the who was the corporal in Dad's Army?
Jones,
Corporal Jones.
Right.
Well, in your role as a corporal in Dad's Army, as you call it, my grandmother always talked about her most vivid memory of the war was going up to your quarry hills.
Yes.
To watch the bombs going off over Belfast. Did that fit into your role?
Well, that fitted into it was Dad's Army that did the aircraft spotting. We had a hut on top of the hill, on top of the quarry, looking out over Belfast and over Lough Neagh, and we could spot aircraft. And what we had to do was report any noise or anything we heard in the sky at night. And that was one of the things that Dad's Army did. The other thing that they did was the Americans would have brought us in for what they called an exercise every other weekend or two, and we as Dad's Army or the Home Guard would have attacked to Merfield. And of course we knew all the drains and all the hedges and everything, and 9 times out of 10 we could defeat the Americans and get right into the centre of the airfield. Right. And we always looked forward to the Sunday afternoon exercise for Dad's Army and get the meal. They went to a big meal afterwards at the canteen. That was the highlight of the day.
Well fed. Okay, well, so some very humorous stories there about that aspect of the war years, but there's a more somber side to it. Presumably, those soldiers would then have gone off to fight in the war in France.
Well, they just disappeared from here. We didn't know until we knew that D-Day had arrived, and we presumed that they were in France.
Right. Well, it was all quite secretive, but quite a lot of those soldiers were presumably would have been killed that were in Moneymore, because the casualties were quite high on D-Day. But we didn't hear about it. There was some of the local girls married American soldiers, and more than there was a few British soldiers married to local girls, and some of them might have heard about somebody that was killed, but we didn't actually know. I didn't actually know any of the soldiers.
Well, you don't know Ken Kempster. Remember, he married Bertha McDowell.
Yes, aye.
He was one of the English Royal Barchers.
And there were quite a few local girls married, both British troops and American soldiers as well. But I don't know that any of those local girls' husbands were killed now, but presumably quite a few of the others would have been, because there were quite a few soldiers about here at that time. So, but we didn't hear that, Paul.
So the camp at Larry Cormac almost emptied out overnight.
I did.
And there was further camp up in Spring Hill?
Spring Hill, yes. Well, that was the same.
Materials didn't disappear overnight, but the staff
and all were
they disappeared.
I think Spring Hill was disbanded about in the late summer of 1944 after the invasion, but the American camp kept on for a while until all the stores were used up, and then that was it then.
Another thing that happened during the war too, and everybody was I think the one was compulsory tillage. The government, the Ministry of Defence or the Ministry of Food, brought out a law that all farmers had to produce 80% of their land into ploughing to grow potatoes and vegetables and all that kind of thing. And one memory that brings back to me is a big field you can see across their brown field at the minute. We had that field that was in potatoes, and we got the potatoes were growing and ready for digging, and we couldn't get them dug because we had nobody to gather the potatoes. But another aspect of the war was in Cookstown. There was a prisoner of war camp known as Moneymore Camp. It's now a housing site, and it was Moneymore Camp. And the Ministry of Food sent us down 60 Italian soldiers to gather the potatoes. And they were delighted to get out because they did not want to be in the war, the Italians.
No.
They were delighted to get out, and I remember my mother used to make big cauldrons of soup, and they loved this soup, getting the soup. And they brought down an army lorries every day and taken home again back to Cookstown at night to the prisoner of war camp.
Using their own fuel, because yours was rationed, I believe.
Oh yes, they used their own. Oh, the army had plenty of fuel. There was no scarcity of stuff as far as the army was concerned.
But people like the doctor I mentioned, Dr. Kirsty, he would have had a right, and the minister.
If you, Johnny, knew when you could have bought up with a black market fuel.
Well, you mentioned the difference between the two camps. Was there any separation?
Yes, there was separation. The coloured soldiers came later on in the war, and they were encamped up at Spring Hill, and they had a separate camp. And of course, initially, when they were off duty, the black soldiers would come down into the town, and the white Americans would have been out as well. And then if they met up on pubs and had a few jars, there were several fights, and quite vicious fights. There was knives used and so on. And the red caps, American red caps or military police, used to come tearing up in jeeps with big long batons, and they would jump out and go into the pubs and soon clear the action there. But eventually they had to have what the locals knew as a black night and a white night. The black soldiers were allowed out on one night, and the white Americans had to stay in, and then vice versa the next night. So the local people got to know this, and they would have said, tonight's a black night, and the coloured soldiers would have been in the town, and then the following night was a white night, and the white Americans would have been in the town. So they had to be segregated. But that didn't last very long, because the coloured soldiers were not here all that long, a matter of less than a year, and then they all disappeared after the invasion of Europe. The camps were all run down.
There was no friction with the locals. It was just
there was no fighting. The locals got on quite well. Some of the coloured Americans used to come to church, and they were great singers. and they used to come to the church in Moneymore, and they would sang Negro spirituals and things like that, and they were really good. They were and they were good musicians. One of them was a very good organist, and he would play the organ in Presbyterian church.
The just forgot what I was going to say there. I'll come back in a minute or two.
So when all these soldiers had moved off and they'd gone off to France to fight, the village calmed back down again.
Yes.
And then the next thing would have been your memory of, well, it wasn't immediate, but of VE Day. What do you remember of victory in Europe?
Well, and VE Day was a great celebration. Of course, the war in Europe was over, and it was only the war against the Japanese was continuing. There was a great celebration in Moneymore. They had a big bonfire on the Fair Hill, and during the war, all the bands were disbanded. There were no bands or no 12th of Julys or anything during the war, and the bands, some of the bands, people in bands would have joined the army and so on, but they got a few big drums in Moneymore, and the big drums paraded up the street and to the bonfire on the Fair Hill. And funny thing I remember about that too, Paul, my father, as I said before, they sold guns and ammunition in the town, and he had rockets that were fired out of a 12-bore shotgun.
Aye, yeah.
And my father
was a thing called a cup discharger at the end.
Aye, well, that was similar on the rifle, but these were actually a cartridge with a long end on them, which was a rocket. And my father had 25 of these. And he brought them out, but we had no shotgun to fire them off. But it shows you the way there was good cooperation in those days. We lived next door to the police station. The sergeant brought out the shotgun that was in the police station, and there was always a shotgun on the wall, Mervyn. It was loaded with buckshot in case they would be raided. It might be raided by the IRA, and this was a means of defence. So he brought down the gun, took buckshot cartridges out, and he fired these rockets off, and they were quite good. They went up into the air just like a rocket, and exploded and all. And so we had a mini fireworks display in Smith Street that night.
Life went on quite as usual during the war years. The only fact that we were rationed with certain kinds of food that we got, but life was generally, it was a quiet time as far as we were concerned.
Another interesting thing too, Paul, there was rationing, as Mervyn said, and food was scarce, and you only got 2 ounces of butter a week or something per person, and we had to use margarine, and beef was the same and all.
Sure.
But there was a NAFE on the Fair Hill.
That's
now,
right.
The army, that was for
Navy, Army,
and Air Force institution. But the local women used to help to make sandwiches and cakes even for the troops, you see. And they had a session of sandwich making every day. Every week, sorry, I think, or maybe twice a week, I think it was. And I remember going as a boy with my mother down, because she was looking after me, and we went down to Hannah's house. The Hannah's house was the mainstay of Moneymore for all benevolent acts, and they made sandwiches there and cakes for this. So I can remember this quite clearly. They had a small amount of butter, but quite a large amount of margarine, and then put it all into a saucepan and melted it on the fire on just a range until it was melted. And they had the bread all spread out, and to make it go further, they put the liquid butter and margarine on with a shaving brush, and that's how to put a very fine coat. Now, nobody ever heard of that before, but that's what the women of Moneymore were doing, and there was a woman.
Painted it on.
She was painting that on with and that's how they made the sandwiches.
There was a great thing in those days about secrecy. Don't tell them. Don't tell anybody. What was the word? There was a saying.
Careless talk.
Careless talk.
Cost lives. Well, then you see in Moneymore, I don't know whether you remember it or not, Eric, they ran the Spitfire funds.
Yes.
I think Moneymore was able to buy 4 or 5 different Spitfires through voluntary things that were on. A Spitfire only cost, in those days, maybe a couple of £3,000 or something like that, you know. But we had
it was a savings effort.
A savings effort.
For a week. And then some of they went round, Master Anderson and Jack Shearer.
That's right.
Walter
Bobby Brown.
And they went round the local people to get them to put money and
invest
savings. And got good interest, and the postmen knew the people in the country that had money, you know.
Yeah.
And in those days, people wouldn't have put their money in the bank. They were afraid to get it in the house, but they would have known that somebody would have had a fair amount of money, and then they would get them to put a few £100, which was a lot of money then, into the saving effort for the week.
Spitfire funds was called, wasn't it?
Aye.
Well, did Moneymore actually lose any soldiers during the war of the locals? Do any of you know? Do you know of any local people who?
Well, they did a few.
Three that we know of. Jim McGaw, who was married to a daughter of James McDowell's. Jim McGaw. He was killed. He was the North Irish horse. He was killed in North Africa. Alan Bain was in the Ark Royal.
He was in the Ark Royal.
He was an engineer aircraft on the Ark Royal. She went down in the Mediterranean. And the third one was Billy Anderson, an adopted son of Master Anderson. I don't know where he was killed, but he was a Moneymore man as well. That was the only 3 that I would know that was killed during the war.
I don't think there was anybody else now that I knew. There were a lot more
casualties. You might still see there's a memorial in the church at the moment for them.
Did Richard Todd live at any stage in Moneymore?
Yes.
In Dixon's house, was it? Or was it now Ronda Glover's?
Richard Todd did live in the Circular Road. His father was a doctor, and when he was a boy, he was brought up in Moneymore. And Mary Bowl could have told you about him. She and some of the other children in Moneymore played with Richard Todd when he was a boy. Mary subsequently met him in London at the theatre many years afterwards, and he remembered being in Moneymore all right. He wasn't born in Moneymore, but he came here. His father was a doctor for 4 or 5 years, and he lived in Moneymore in the Circular Road.
Of course, then he went on to have a famous role in the Dam Busters in particular.
He was very famous afterwards.
Any other characters from this area that you remember well from those years?
There were quite a few people, and one of the people I remember.
Quite a few people, but they didn't know they were characters.
They didn't know they were characters. Well, there was David Mitchell, of course, a local undertaker, and he was a well-known character. But another character who I had come along with was Johnny Greer. Johnny Greer was a wonderful man. He served in the First World War. He was captured at the Battle of the Somme, and he escaped 5 times from prisoner of war camps in Germany. He got away the 5th time. He was recaptured 4 times. Then he subsequently fought in the Mesopotamian campaign in the 1920s, when the Arabs in Mesopotamia, which was a bit British protected, and they rebelled, and the British sent 3 or 4 gunboats up the Tigris to quell this rebellion, and Johnny Greer was in that. And when I was a boy, Johnny and I did a lot of fishing together. He taught me to fish, and he would tell me about his escapades in Mesopotamia, and I heard all the names that were in the last Iraq war, Kirkuk and Fallujah, Samara. Johnny Greer had been there and told me all about that years before, and it was interesting to see it coming again. But Johnny joined up in the Second World War as well, and he must have been about 50 years of age at the outbreak of war. But he told the recruiting people that he was only 35. But they subsequently found out his age, and he didn't have to have active service. But he served throughout the war. But when Johnny came home on leave, he always went, as they say here, on the tear, Mervyn. And he would go on a binge, you see, and then he would overstay his leave, and the red caps would have to come and take him back again, you see. But he was a wonderful character.
But the fact that there was only 3 people killed from Moneymore doesn't mean that there wasn't a lot of people. There was a lot of people from Moneymore had joined the forces during the war. I remember after the war started, I went to Belfast to Clifton Street along with a friend of mine to join the Air Force. And went through all the pros and cons of joining the Air Force. But when I came home again, and eventually the inquiries came through to Moneymore police station about this fellow Glover who wanted to join the Air Force, would they be all right type of thing, you see. But I was disallowed. Wasn't taken, they wouldn't take me in the Air Force because we were in the quarry business. My father was in the quarry business, and it was a war effort business, and they needed a certain amount of people with know-how still kept back at home to run the businesses, because they needed the quarries to make their aerodromes, the army camps, they needed all that, you see. And if they let everybody go, well, there would have been nothing happening.
But there was quite a few people from Moneymore in the Second World War.
Quite a few.
And do you think has Moneymore changed for the better since then? What are your immediate thoughts on Moneymore after the war and the?
Well, I think really, Paul, the war was maybe good for our generation, Mervyn, in a sense.
Yes, there was a period after the war of slack, not very much business period, but the country began to gather itself together again, and in a few years things got a kind of back to normal again, and people got back into business and back into work, and money became available for doing things.
But we learned to live fairly Spartan lives during the war, and I thought it stood to our generation. I mean, we don't.
You couldn't buy clothes. You couldn't buy
anything
without ticket. Without
you had to make do.
Tickets.
You had to make do with what you had.
Coupons were called.
There were coupons for everything, and ration books, and
somebody wrote a wedding thing one day. My wedding reception. People always got telegrams in those days, and the telegram I got was coupons for tea, coupons for meat, coupons for this, coupons for that, but Mervyn got anything coupon free.
Very good.
So there were some, and I'm sure your generation passed that on to the next generation.
Well, probably that's
I
right.
think the present generation even know nowadays that there was a war.
Well, that has died out. Probably the next generation were similar to our generation, but then gradually, when things became more normal and everything was in abundance, they forgot the Spartan lives, and people of our generation don't throw things out, we say they might be useful. People don't do that nowadays. There's a different philosophy just. But I think it was good for us in a way, and we learned and we lived quite healthy lives, Mervyn. We certainly weren't overweight.
It was a lot of fun, Eric.
It was good fun, and
we had to make, there was no TV, there was no nothing like that at all. No cars. You had to make your own entertainment. There was dances every day, every week,
and concerts, and people. Local people performed at those, and now you don't get that same input by
TV
people
is
now. No.
That's fascinating, man. I know you could go on talking all day, but we're just going to draw this to a close. I'd love to thank you very much, Mervyn and Eric, for sharing your experiences with us. And I'd also like to thank Colleen Lennox for setting this up, and for Johnny Palmer over here behind the camera. Maybe we'll get another opportunity to hear more of your memories, but for today, for Moneymore, thank you very much.
It takes somebody to prompt you. Because there's so many things that happened, so many stories to tell.
We need to go week by
Week,
week.
next week, like next. So from Paul McMenemy here in Moneymore, we end this edition of At Home with Mervyn and Eric, not Eric and Ernie, and we'll be back next week for another episode.